Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard, for inviting me back here again. It's a great pleasure to come back to a second time and to participate in this this lively event. So thank you for that, and thank you, Franz, for moderation, and thank you everybody for coming tonight. So hopefully you'll see your favourite politician somewhere in amongst that lot. So this isn't going to work. So what's going on with you? So, no, it's not. I'm sorry, but there are two things. One, of course, all the science fiction films that you will see about the takeover of and destruction of humanity by technology. It's never going to happen because we simply cannot get one computer to talk to a light bulb. And the thing is, though, if you remember the Terminator film, it's so unlikely because the way to shoot the Terminator is when it's downloading the next patch. The screen goes blue, then you shoot it. Yeah, that's what right. Okay. It's still not going to work. Okay. So let me start. So first of all, I am from the soon-to-be disunited kingdom. But I'd like to start off with a small anecdote. Okay, so from the Republic of Absurdistan. Yeah. So there's an act of parliament that's come before the parliament in Absurdistan. It says these things. Yeah? A minister may by regulations make such provision as the minister considers appropriate if the minister considers that such provision should be in force. Regulations under this section may not do these three things: increase taxation, make retrospective provision, or create a criminal offence. But regulations under this section may make any provision that can be made by an act of parliament, including modifying this act. Okay? So the first clause says you can do anything he or she wants. The second clause says you can't do that. But the third clause says, but if he changes his mind, he can go back and do it. Okay? You can change it as he wants. Yeah? Who'd like to be a politician with these rules? Yeah? Yeah, sounds good. There's a few people who want to be on my first slide. Yeah? So, does anybody actually know where this comes from? Yeah, it is Absurdistan. Yeah. Okay, so if this actually works, so it's not. Yeah. So, okay, if you go down, so the key word there it is. Yeah. This is the European Union Withdrawal Bill that is currently going before the UK Parliament. Yeah? And as you can see, the clauses are, and I've turned them round, a minister can do what they like. The third clause says you can't do that, but oh look, the second clause says, but you can change it if you wanted to. Yeah? This is a bill that's going through what we'd like to style as the mother of all parliaments. I mean, the other thing that we've... can we fix it? Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry to go on about this, but any conversation in the UK at the moment, whatever the weather, it's only a matter of time before we talk about Brexit. Okay? So I will mention this once or twice, but this was something else that happened in discussions after the referendum, that the standard response to the people who were complaining about the fact that the Remain side had lost was this: we had a vote, you lost, that's democracy, now shut up. Yeah. So their version of democracy is that you have one vote, that's it, it's written in stone forever after, and that anybody who disagrees with it has thereafter got to stop talking. So then, our third question here. So I don't know whether any of you know this book. This is by Francis Fukuyama, which he wrote in about 96, 97 after the Berlin Wall came down. And he said, this is the future, that we're all going to live in nice liberal democracies. Yeah? And so he wrote this book, The End of History. There was never going to be any argument about what kind of political regime that we were going to live in. We were all going to live in liberal democracies. What's happened wind that forward 20 years, and you can go into the politics sections of bookshops, and you'll see loads of books with these titles about how democracies die, how democracy is in danger, how democracy ends. So my question is, how did we get from there to the point that we are now? Okay. So we can see that democracy is under threat from at least 3 different directions. Now, why is this important? The thing that's motivating some of my work is this observation that we're transforming to the digital society. We're going through this idea called the digital transformation. And that's going to produce a new range of interactive applications. And in particular, we're going to have to interact with each other and interact with some forms of artificial intelligence. An example here is a community energy system. So this is what's happening when we're trying to make your house self-sustained in terms of its energy provision. So you have a number of appliances that you want to run, but you might have some kind of renewable that's generating your electricity for you. So what's the obvious thing to do here? Well, if you generate as much as you need, everything is fine. But under certain circumstances, the sun's not going to shine, certainly not in the United Kingdom. You're not going to get enough. Where are you going to make up the shortfall? Other occasions, it's too sunny, so you're outside in the garden, you're not using anything anyway, you've got too much. What are you going to do with the excess? Well, the thing to do is obviously it's to team up with another house. Yeah? And then you can trade off when you've got too much, when they haven't got enough, and vice versa. And then actually, why stop there with 2 houses? You have a village about it. And this is what we mean by a community energy system. And so then you have a whole village which is pooling their energy and taking from it what they need as and when they need it. And you're still going to have the same problems in a local region. Sometimes you generate too much, sometimes not enough. So then you cooperate with other villages and so on. You build up an aggregated community energy system and so on. One of the things we can see is that there are at least 4 levels of interaction here, of which you can only see 2, because for some reason it's still cutting off the bottom of my slide. Why is it doing that? So I'll have to tell you what they are. So delegated. So at this point, the really smart thing to do is when you've got problems like frequency control and voltage control, which you want to control on a network basis with a power grid, is that you get all the fridges and you get them to coordinate their compressor cycles. And this is the really smart use of a whole bunch of fridges. This is what is, in academic terms, a real multi-agent system. You then get the programmable level where these days you can buy a smart appliance like your dishwasher or washing machine, and you can either choose to run it straight away, or you can have a schedule, and then you specify when you want it done by, and your dishwasher will then negotiate with the grid when it will actually have the power and do it. There's also, not here, there's an attentive level where this is when you may be facing some kind of overload point and you need to turn something off. Now the grid could take that decision for you, but the trouble is the grid doesn't know what matters to you at this time. Yeah? So you could be having the television on in the background, and it doesn't matter if it gets turned off, you won't really notice. However, it could be the television on and it's the World Cup. Oh, hang on, you guys didn't qualify for the World Cup, did you? Sorry. Okay, but there is this thing called a World Cup and people play. So you don't want to turn the television off at that point yet. And the 4th level is this engaged level, where you're actually having to make investment decisions. I mean, these wires, these renewable energy sources, don't just install themselves. They have to be bought, they have to be installed, they have to be linked up together, and so on. So you want to be making investment decisions. So you can see, you could have the next slide. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, that actually there's an issue of collective governance at every single level in this system. And that then applies to all of the particular applications that we can see in this digital transformation, whether it's for commerce, for entertainment, for media, and so on. We're getting these same participations and the same active artificial intelligences that are involved. So given that we've got this common requirement, which we are observing at multiple different levels, and having to satisfy multiple different interests, because we've got the consumers, but we've also got the suppliers, the people writing the programs on the apps on your smart meter, lots of different interests that you're trying to satisfy. And you've got to effectively come up with a solution to a public action problem, in particular collective action problems, where you want a bunch of people to coordinate and cooperate with their behaviours to achieve a collective goal, rather than each of them individually satisfying their own particular goals. And generally speaking, we want to do that to try and protect our security, to take care of our welfare, whatever this actually means in these different applications, and specifically to avoid tyranny, so that there isn't just one person or one small group in charge that is running the whole system in their interests rather than in the common interest. Yeah? And you want to do that taking care of things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, making sure that everybody has an equal voice, and treating people with a certain amount of dignity. So if you want to do that, then we can analyze political science and the history of political regimes, and that would suggest that some form of democracy is going to provide you with these sort of features. And so then the question becomes, well, if we know that it is a democratic political regime that is going to allow us to produce the optimum form of, the least bad form of collective self-governance, how is it that instead of just sort of throwing a bunch of rules out there and relying on luck and the people to produce something, how can we actually give them something from the start that they can use? And this is now what I'm calling, sorry, next slide, please. Sorry, thank you. Democracy by design, which is a form of value-sensitive design. This was an idea that goes back about 20 years. We're trying to go beyond just designing systems with functional and non-functional requirements, but trying to make sure that we understand what is of value to the users and making sure that those values are the things that are provided by the system. In this case, the value that we're trying to promote is democracy. Yeah? So how do we do that? In particular, how can we provide these socio-technical systems in the digital transformation which avoid what we see at the moment, which is the private ownership of the means of social coordination? Because arguably one of the things that's happened is that the network effects occurring at the application layer have allowed just a few small companies to dominate particular spheres of internet activity. And then they actually control how it is that we, the demos, can actually solve our collective action problems. So if we want to break that up, we need an architecture, and we need to architect these systems, a new software architecture, according to a number of principles that will create this value that we want, which is democracy. And these are the 8 foundational principles that I'm going to go for. The first one is prevention rather than reinvention. So you want to prevent the descent of your system into some form of tyranny, whether that's oligarchy, autocracy, or majoritarian tyranny. I'll discuss those terms later, rather than letting it go into one of these autocratic states and then you having to drag it back. We should also recognize that, as we're seeing with Fukuyama, democracy is not an end state, nor is it the default. Yeah? So you shouldn't just assume that because your system starts off nicely democratic, it's always going to stay that way. Thirdly, the democracy should be embedded in the design. So when you're building these systems, you don't build the system that you want and then think, well, how can I make it democratic afterwards? You make sure that you attend to these democratic principles while you're doing that. Fourthly, no compromises on democratic processes, so don't start taking shortcuts. It turns out that you actually have to work at democracy, that individuals have to be involved, that there are costs that you have to put in, but you get that back in other forms of recompense. You need visibility, you need inclusivity, you need transparency, and you need accountability. Yeah? And I mean these in the truest senses of the word, so we need to know who is making what type of decision and who benefits from it. Yeah? So it's not just a matter of taking some measurements, there's some real principles underneath this. Sixth, we have to recognize the interdependence of diversity. As I said, there are multiple stakeholders involved in these things normally, and if you just maximize one of their interests, it's like a suspension bridge. If you only have one side of it, it will collapse. You need these things in tension and then they're mutually supporting. Seventh, we need education in the recognition of the pro-social benefits. So people who are joining the system have to know why it is that they have these rules. They have to understand what value that it brings and why it is that they should participate in it, and importantly, that their participation is done properly, or at least as well as can be expected. And finally, we do need some kind of procedural evaluation, so we do need metrics of some kind, but we've got to make sure that the data that is being collected and the metrics that are being used to evaluate whether these institutions are fit for purpose or not are actually relevant. So that's democracy by design. So, yeah. And there are three main aspects to this now, yeah, which I'm going to go through, okay, underpinning this. So one is about self-determination, second one is about knowledge management, and the third one is about values itself. Yeah. So this issue of self-determination is trying to make sure that the people who are affected by a set of rules get to participate in the selection, the modification, the application and enforcement of those rules. And in previous work that I talked about in this forum, we were working on the formalization of Elinor Ostrom's design principles for self-governing institutions. So it's for this work that she was actually awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Science way back in 2009 for coming up with this observation, firstly, that throughout history, communities have been faced with the problem of how they sustain a common pool resource. And that very often they formed a set of rules by which they voluntarily agreed to regulate and constrain their behavior, which would achieve the overall collective goal of sustaining the resource rather than maximizing their individual benefits. And having seen that observation, she said, well, there's certain features of these rules, she said. Sometimes they were present and sometimes they were absent. And when one or more was absent, then generally speaking, the resource was not sustained. So again, she did the same thing that I said back on earlier. When you're faced with one of these situations, if you know what the features are that you want to, that will preserve the resource, and you need to have an institution, design one. Yeah? Don't trust to luck to emerge one. And of course, for these 8 institutional design principles, she was awarded this Nobel Prize. And if you noticed, I had 8 principles, and anybody who wants to suggest that if I have 8 principles, therefore I should get a Nobel Prize, that's a kind of cynicism that we can really do without at the moment. However, we can see here that what's going on is that the basis of it all is the invention of conventional rules. Yeah, so these are rules that we make up and we agree to follow and we can actually break. And actually in that breaking, there's huge possibilities for human behavior which are not necessarily available to us if we just have a machine that's literally interpreting the wording on a contract. So we mutually can agree to voluntarily constrain and regulate our behavior. And one of the really interesting ones, that you can create institutions like this which last thousands of years. And the one that I like to refer to is the Charter of the Forest. So this was the one that followed the Magna Carta in 1215, which was the barons ensuring that the king couldn't nick their property because of whim or caprice. But the Charter of the Forest was the first charter for the ordinary free man or woman to have access to forestries and pastures and to say what they could and could not do to it. And that was in 1217. It was only enshrined in UK law in the 1970s. So this thing lasted for the base part of 800 or 900 years. So hugely enduring institution for this. So that's the first thing we need to do for underpinning these principles of democracy by design. The second one is, I hope, is going to be knowledge management. Okay. Thank you. It turns out, yeah, there have basically been 3 stages in democracy. Yeah. So the first one followed the agrarian revolution about 10,000 years ago, yeah, and was combined with the cognitive revolution. As it turned out, these were very, very egalitarian societies. There wasn't one guy who was enforcing things from the top. In fact, it turns out that if somebody tried to do that, they would get either ostracized or killed by the others. There was a very egalitarian distribution of power and resources. They then faced a problem of both scale and complexity. And as a result of scale and complexity, you got hierarchy and authority-bearing roles. Yeah? And so largely we started forming empires. And it wasn't until about 800 BC that you had the Greek democracy emerging in Athens. And the question was, that's been asked, how was it that Athens was so successful for so long in comparison to all the other city-states at the time, when it had an equality of resources, equality of territory, equality of manpower, and so on? Now, it turns out that the keys to democracy, I always had this idea that it was one person, I'm going to say it's one man, one vote, because they didn't have terribly enlightened ideas about women and slavery at the time. I'm sorry about that. But you go down to the agora, one man, one vote, and that's how decisions were taken. That wasn't it at all, or rather, sorry, that was the tip of the iceberg. Underneath that iceberg, they had these phenomenally sophisticated knowledge management processes, which actually were the things that created the successful decision making. So the first one was this process of knowledge aggregation, where actually they had various systems which made sure that the right information got to the right people at the right time in order for them to make an informed decision. Having collectively made this informed decision, they then had this process of knowledge alignment, which allowed people to know that, okay, this is what we're going to do. Yeah? So if the decision had been that we're all going to go and fight the Spartans, for example, then you're supposed to turn up with a sword and a shield. Yeah? I mean, and so this was a credible commitment to actually participate in this, and so they would know that this is what they would have to do. And underpinning all that, you had this process of knowledge codification. It was curious enough, the invention of language, particularly the invention of the vowel, that allowed people to write this kind of thing down in a way that it could persist. And so then, faced with a problem, a collective action problem of some kind, they could actually say, okay, well, this is what we need to do. Actually, these are the processes that we need to follow to actually implement a successful solution. It's all codified there. So they're able to leverage these things in the pursuit of not only making the right decision, but acting upon it to get the right result as well. And so then the third thing, is the sovereignty that's going on here. And that sovereignty is, I think, based on the bits of token that you circulate around in order to create an economy. And it's quite crucial because that economy, based on various interactions and transactions, it's like the air flowing under a wing that supports the aircraft. If you have that economy, then you can build these other values on top of it. And these values are really important. So they've been studied in numerous domains: economics, politics, philosophy, psychology, and so on. So there's a general agreement that values exist. They are part of our socially constructed reality. Yeah? But just like we made up the rules to regulate our behavior, to sustain the resource, we also make up values which are associated sometimes with just following those rules. Yeah? I mean, think about game playing. Game playing is dependent on having a set of rules. People who follow the rules are considered to be good sports, and people who don't follow the rules considered to be cheats. So many of these people who study this, they actually say it's a really intrinsic part of what makes us human, what distinguishes, differentiates us from other mammals. Yeah? It's the fact that we have these values, we can invent them, we can reason with them, and we communicate them to each other so that we can share in them. One particular type of value, of course, is social capital. Yeah? And I'm not a great fan of this term because as an enlightened president of the United States, even before the current one, said, apparently after he won his second term, apparently I've got some social capital, so I'm going to spend it. It doesn't work like that. Yeah? Social capital is a kind of potential that allows you to show leadership in solving collective action problems. But what we're going to have to do is go from the social capital that is part of our constructed reality in the analog world and have its equivalent in the digital world. And this, of course, is, I'm referring to this as the stored program concept, the stored value concept, sorry. So the stored program concept was this brilliant piece of insight that goes back to the early days of the computers, which asks, what does a sequence of zeros and ones mean? Yeah? Well, the answer is anything you like. It could represent a number, it could represent a letter, it could represent an instruction. And the thing is, what distributed ledger technology does is it allows us to do the same kind of thing. We have something in our cryptocurrency. It could represent a unit of currency. It could represent something else as well, whatever we want it to mean. Yeah? And that gives us the basis of designing what I'm referring to as axial cryptocurrencies. Yeah? And these are crucially systems of exchange in which the tokens can actually represent more than just transactional information. It allows us to represent reputation, and it allows us to represent reputation as well. And this is actually taking us right back to some of the more tribal societies, as was studied, for example, by Malinowski, who's a legal anthropologist, who is studying the way that economies worked in the Trobriand Islands in the Pacific Ocean. So what would happen is that somebody would make something, and then they'd get in their canoe, and then they would paddle at some risk to themselves and present it as a gift to a chief in another island. But it was considered the height of bad manners to hang on to this gift. That person then had to get in their canoe and paddle to another island at some risk to themselves and present it as a gift. Yeah. And eventually it was called the ring cycle because this gift would come back to the original person that made it. And he'd shrug his shoulders and go, right, get back in my canoe and paddle off to an island and give it away as a gift again. But the crucial thing is that this created relations, this exchange of gifts, created bonds between the different islanders so that when there was a problem, they would all pitch in to help each other out. So this was the crucial thing. The exchange created that value, that circulation. There's a reason why we call currency, we say it's in currency, call it currency and say it's in circulation. It's because it creates that platform on which other values can be built. And so that's crucial here because it will maintain the link between, actually, I'm almost done. Sorry. The link between the rules and the values that they support, because that's not always obvious. It helps us to resist this tendency towards metrication, commodification, and even dissolution of values. And the great thing about this is that it's the monopoly acquisition of this kind of token. If you get them all, it means you've lost. If I made one last anecdote, two things I want to say there. So, okay, then I'll stop. Yeah, okay. So I used to be part of this babysitting circle. And the way that we did it is that we had these tokens. Yeah? When you did a babysitting favour, then you got a token. If you got all the tokens, it meant you'd lost, yeah, because you didn't go out. You did all the babysitting. Yeah? So you're not trying to create the monopoly here. And the last thing, why does this matter, I hope? Yeah? Why does this? So for one thing, I hope some of the stuff that I've said about will restore some collegiate and knowledge-based self-organisation for local governance. Yeah. They'll provide us with some insight into democratic theory, because I think one of the problems that the whole of Europe is facing is this slide from populism into potential extremism. But critically, I mean, maybe more so for me than an enlightened culture like yours, but a real public understanding of what democracy actually means. For one thing, there's the responsible knowledge management. You know all about fake news and the way that this creates ghettos of misinformation. Absolutely crucial about the importance of civic education and critical thinking, why it is that you need to participate in these democratic processes, what they are getting for you and why you need to invest your time in it. And that you have to, I tell my students all of this, that you've got to question everything. And disappointingly, none of them ever turn around to me and say, why? But you mentioned this, the diminution of critical thinking in education systems is becoming more and more apparent throughout the world. Yeah? And that's because some of these companies that own these large platforms, they want people who are just smart enough to operate the machinery, but not smart enough to ask any difficult questions about why.
I think, Professor Jeremy, we need to test the smartness of the people. So if you can round it up, and then we have some one or two questions.
Yeah, of course. I'm so sorry. Yeah. For a person who talks about sustainability and common pool resources, I've got the resource. And you have to prize it out of my, no. Okay, if we could just, my point is we'd all want to live, as Fukuyama said, in nice liberal democracies, but that's not the end point. And we have to fight to preserve these things. And when we're building these systems, we have to make sure that we put them in. That's the last slide. Sorry. I will leave you with this thought. Ariel Dorfman from Chile. Yeah? Do not cry tomorrow for that which you did not have the courage and wisdom to defend today. You have a democracy, but you can lose it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. You're obviously very enthusiastic about this topic, and I think all of us, because it impacts so much our generation and the generations after us, what the digitization of society will mean, how it impacts the fabric of society. So I have one question, looking at the time, for the audience. Who I can give the cube? Try to throw it.
Much. Thank you, Professor. You've mentioned that democracy by design is an instance of value-centric design. And looking at Bitcoin, that brings us all here together once a month, it was built precisely on a lack of a fundamental value, that's trust. And how do you see systems that are based on lack of value, designed precisely like the cryptocurrency Bitcoin?
Yeah, so one question, you just rolled the grenade in, right? Thank you for that, yeah. So I will be honest. So I was one of the 4 people who, when Richard said, who hasn't invested in any kind of cryptocurrency, and that's me. So I am a good academic, I study these things, I don't actually participate, yeah. So, and that's why I'm poor as well, yeah.
Well, Joan can tell you what time to buy the Bitcoin, right? I mean, exactly, for the last session this evening.
Yeah, thank you, yeah, that's right. How much is that going to cost me, yeah. But I think you're absolutely right, though, because one of my big criticisms of this is that actually the trust relationship between us and a cryptocurrency is based on leveraging an existing trust relationship between us and a financial institution that we do trust, like a bank. Yeah? And actually what we're being asked to do is to put now that trust in the programmer. And not just the programmer, the person who told that programmer what to do. And that could be severely misplaced. So within this democracy by design and designing those actual currencies, this is one of the issues that we have to make sure that we take care of. Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. It's very, very pertinent.
Thanks very much, Professor Pitt. Thanks.